Okay. Well, we're a few minutes past the hour, so I'll go ahead and get started. But thank you again to everyone for joining us live. My name is Jennifer Shacken. I am with New England Forestry Foundation, which is an organization that's been a member of the Climate Smart Wood Group steering committee for the last couple of years. And I just have a few introduction slides for us before we turn to our speakers. And the first is just to note that the Climate Smart Wood Group really came together to help the building sector in North America procure climate smart wood products. And it's built on the premise that interest in better wood can create market incentives to improve the way forests are managed and really help fulfill the full potential of forests as a climate solution. And so the organizations you see here are represented on the steering committee. It's currently a volunteer-driven effort. We don't have a part-time or full-time staff or anything like that. So if you're interested in getting involved or you would like to ask a question, you can certainly do so at the email here, which is info@climatesmartwood.net. But just please that in mind when you reach out, that there's a lot of volunteers behind the scenes making this thing happen. And I have to take a moment to have a huge thank you to our sponsors, including Lowe's, Timberlab, and Columbia Forest Products. These are the companies that are making it possible to provide our website and all of the resources that are there. There's an updated guide to climate smart wood procurement that we were recently able to update, which also lives on the website. And of course, this webinar series. So a big thank you to them for, providing that boost to create the capacity to create these resources and create this community for information. If you or your organization would like to get more involved, there are a number of ways you can do that, including donating to this effort, also becoming a sponsor and joining the folks on the previous slide, of course, attending the webinars like you're doing today, and really using the procurement guide that's on the website, kind of putting this work into action in your practice. This is the second in a monthly series that will be happening over the course of 2026. As I mentioned before, all the webinars are being recorded and will be available on our website after the fact. Our speakers today are Josh Cabot with SERA Architects and Jacob Dunn with ZGF Architects. I'll let them introduce themselves shortly. But one last note before I turn it over to them, that we have the Q&A function enabled for this webinar. So please feel free to submit questions at any time throughout the presentation. Everyone will be able to see the questions, and we'll wrap a little before the end of the hour, maybe about 10 of, so we'll have time to field some of those questions live and can follow up with some of you after the fact. And with that, I will turn it over to Josh.
Okay, thank you, Jen. All right, I hope you can all see my screen at this point.
Yes, looks good.
Perfect. All right, thank you so much. All right, welcome everyone. So glad you could join us, that you're interested in this important topic. I'm joined here by my partner in Clarity, Jacob Dunn, over at ZGF. We're both architects based in Portland, Oregon. And we have been working over the past 3 or 4 years really on pushing transparency in wood sourcing process, because we feel like any intention that you might have is going to require some level of transparency and traceability to be able to prove out the claims that you're making. So we will dive right in. Here we are. Okay, so the climate smart forestry definitions, we like to start here. What are key features? It can be sometimes difficult to describe what makes something climate smarter or what is responsible sourcing when it comes to forestry. So we're often looking at features like mitigation, where you're able to increase carbon storage within the forest products, within the forest itself and through the way in which you're harvesting these wood products. Adaptation, of course, with the forest in mind, and thinking about how are we harvesting in ways that are going to, improve forestry health. And then equity, the whole social dynamic piece. And all of this is really about trying to aim above the regulatory baseline. And so uh, as we dig in here, the procurement guide is now in its third iteration. Hopefully, a lot of you know. It just got released in January. And so it hits on these three kind of main areas of traceability and transparency, procurement options, resources. And then now we have a much more expanded project phases, this fourth part that gets more into implementation, that we're really excited to talk about today. Um, the three main procurement pathways in the guide relate to recycled, reclaimed, salvaged wood, certified wood, and then this third one that is a little harder to ascertain and kind of like climate smart forestry itself, it really relies on being able to chart and make claims around forestry that we believe are meeting those goals of adaptation, mitigation, equity in the community. But to do any of that, you need transparency. You need to be able to look back and understand by traceability how these claims can be made, and especially for that third one when we're doing our sort of choose our own adventure of something that is not documented as reclaimed, salvaged, recycled, or something that doesn't have a certification with it, but still may be very climate smart. So start a little bit with definitions. This is found in the procurement guidance. Now, traceability is that ability to trace back through the supply chain to understand where that product came from. It could be in a product backward approach, which is often what I think a lot of us on design teams are kind of confronted with, where you have to be able to look back and say, where did this come from? You might be doing that when you're specifying material. You might even be learning about that during the submittal process as we lead up, to construction, saying, "Oh, that's where that is coming from," or you're doing it even at the end of a project, and to think like, "Where did that come from?" A material forward approach would be much more market driven, in which entities are pushing out information, and you're able to trace that way. So that could be a more proactive means, and we'll dig into that a little bit later today too. Transparency is really, of course, I think a lot of us know it's just sort of how open we are about information sharing. We recognize that in market-based economies, it can be challenged because people have trade secrets, people want to maintain certain relationships. There can be concerns around trust, and people don't want to expose themselves and then be maligned in the marketplace for some reason. So transparency is a challenge. I think a lot of us really want transparency, but then in actual practice, it can be difficult for market actors. But just know that in order for traceability to even really, well, we should just say this. Traceability is made infinitely easier by having transparency. You could still trace back things. It's just a lot harder if the actors in the supply chain aren't being transparent about what they have. This is a slide that we often like to show. There's sort of different tools that we can have for understanding where our products are coming from. And in the past, we've presented along with Scott Mooney from Bora Architects too, who really started with this food analogy that's off to the right. And so, you can look at a top down in the way that you source your food. You may just be assuming, hey, I'm buying my food in a grocery store. I assume it was, legally grown, harvested, and brought to market. And so it must align with some regulations. We could say the same for our forestry. In America, there are forest practice acts in many states, not all. And we know that, in many cases, what is being harvested is probably not illegally harvested. So you could just rest on that and say, well, that's responsible enough. You might go to the next level, which says kind of towards the middle of labeling. And this would be things like certified organic produce. Well, similarly, we do that all the time in the design world, where we might say, I want to source SFI or FSC wood because that certification tells me, okay, I know that there has been a process. There are some standards that go above the regulatory floor, and that makes me feel better. I can pass that along to my client. And it's, as we often say, it's kind of the shorthand for responsible sourcing, knowing that the certification is there. That said, you may still never know where your actual material is coming from. You can just rest assured it's probably better than baseline. And then that bottom piece with connected, that's really where you can turn things and kind of go from a bottom up approach rather than top down. And that is much more tied to storytelling through being connected. Imagine going to a farmer's market where you're meeting a farmer that is in the area that you're living in, and you're able to learn about how they're growing their, could be produce, could also be their forests, and start to understand whether how their values align to yours. And it can become a much more enriching sort of process too. And it allows for storytelling through your projects. I think ZGF work at the Portland airport has been really like a hallmark project in the sense that it has connected people back to, it connected the project back to the land and really understanding where that wood is from and how the whole community really came around to help create that space. And I think we're starting to see that in a lot more projects. And it gets to that other kind of a term that we've heard out there called forest to frame rather than farm to table. So being able to connect your project back to those forests of origin. So when we don't have any transparency, when you sort of you get what you get and you don't get upset, you can claim that you probably met the legal minimums if you know that your wood is at least sourced in the United States. Be aware that if you're sourcing internationally, that can become even harder to claim. Uh, Illegal logging is actually the third largest transnational crime in the world after human trafficking and drug trafficking. It's kind of unbelievable. So there are tools that exist out there to help you with that. But if you're sourcing in the United States, you probably are sure that you're meeting the legal minimum. Um, there are, it could be a wide spectrum of landowner types and a wide spectrum of harvest practices. With transparency, that starts to open up new pathways. So you can be, you might start to learn about the landowner types. You may be able to even learn. Are these coming from indigenous landowners? Are they coming from, small family forests? Are they coming from even state forests or other public lands that might be of interest to you? Um, it allows you to tell a more local story often, and it can also allow you to align sort of your sourcing to the client's values, and maybe to the location as well. Maybe you're trying to go for a very tight sourcing window, or sort of sourcing radius to your project by starting to understand where your wood's coming from, you can make those claims. Otherwise, you really can't. So why is it so challenging, especially with wood? This is a graphic that's also in the procurement guide. This sort of shows the two different flows that are happening when we're sourcing products. So we have on the left side, really the supply chain that is sourcing um, the value chain kind of goes from the top and works its way down. You're moving from forest all the way through the mill onto manufacturer, where in a mass timber context, you might be pressing CLT panels or glue lambs. And then it's going to a fabricator. It's being, tooled and ready to be brought to site. And then it's, of course, being brought out and erected into place. But disclosure kind of works the opposite direction in that when you are trying to learn about when you're trying to trace where your products are coming from, you're starting to reach back up through that chain. So we say sometimes it's kind of like a salmon swimming upstream. This would also be, in this context, it's kind of a product backward approach. So you're looking back up, trying to find as far back as you can. And I think one key area that is always a challenge is at the mill level. As you may know, in a lot of mills and in log yards, this wood is coming from many different sources, and it's a very dynamic place. Wood is being brought in, it's many times being set and starting to be sorted and intermixed, and it becomes really challenging to know that whether you can make a claim that a certain piece of wood that is in your building really came from a certain forest. The mill is a mixing zone, and it can be super challenging unless you're willing to go the extra sort of mile and ask for segregated milling, which is something that is challenging. It's asking a mill to sort of change their usual efficient processes to move a certain batch of wood from a certain stand or harvest through the mill at a certain time. It's not impossible, and it has been done, but it's not something that many mills are doing yet these days. And so we have to be able to like work through that and understand what is the right amount of information that we need to be able to make the right claims for our projects. This also gets really complicated, as you can see, when you start to think about all the different sources that are coming through into even just one project. Many times CLT may not be sourced from the same manufacturer as the glue lamb. Those could be different manufacturers. And in turn, those manufacturers are pulling from different mills. They're pulling from different forests. And so it gets pretty complicated pretty fast. This is it sort of all put together. Um, so what can we do? How can we start to trace these things out? There are some tools that are listed up on the procurement guide website for climate smart wood. One is around chain of custody documentation. That's a little different than chain of custody certification. So you may be aware of the Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, chain of custody. That is wonderful because you certainly know that at each step in the value chain, along the way, it was meeting those FSC guidelines. And so that is, that can make you feel or sort of rest assured that you're getting a product that has been responsibly sourced and brought to you, although you may not know exactly what all those steps in the chain were. Chain of custody documentation will actually sort of walk you through each of those steps. And while it is possible with FSC, it's not always sort of the baseline of what you might get with FSC wood. There are other things like lumber grade stamps. This is sort of more of like detective work. You can start to figure out what mills did it come from? Geez, where do those mills source from? Once again, this is like a very product backward kind of approach. QR codes and inventory tags, that is something we see, especially in reclaimed wood, where you may be tagging something when you've harvested it and it's going to a place like a municipal log yard. That can also be a good clue. And then you get into things that are more systematic, like commercial traceability tools that are out there that are starting to emerge. I mean, this is still kind of leading edge stuff. And then there are internal traceability tools too that a lot of mills do know exactly where their wood is coming from because they have to, understand the volumes and the landowners and all of that. It's just how much of that do they actually want to disclose? And because it's dynamic all the time, how much can they actually give to you and with a reasonable sense of confidence that's exactly the wood that you're getting because of the intermixing nature. And the last one on there is wood ID testing. This is something that we've seen that pilot credit within LEED before that is still around, and this is a way you could ascertain the sort of provenance of your wood. You can test it. But once again, that's still detective work. That's usually looking backward. That's not necessarily helping you work with your client at the beginning of a project to say, oh, let's try to align our sourcing around these kinds of values or these kinds of landowners or this kind of geography. And I think it's important to respect the limits of transparency. When we're asking for information, we don't really just want a total data dump. That may be kind of counterproductive to what we're trying to do. You end up with a bunch of data at the end of the project. Do you actually have the resources to parse through that? And out of that, can you pull information that's actionable? So I think we have to always ask ourselves, what's the desired outcome? What are we really looking for? And I think we need to respect people's limits on their privacy. We've heard this through lots of interviews out around the country that we've been a part of, and that also others, like in the Green Commons and Building Green, have done, where we've heard landowners say, I'm afraid of being doxxed. I'm afraid of having people point to me and say something about my practices that may or may not be true or that could hurt my ability to participate in this market. I think things that we're really interested in as we've gone down this transparency journey have really focused on landowner type as a first place to start. You can sort of stop there, and you can also stop at even the county line. You don't need specific coordinates on a particular harvest in order to understand what kind of wood you're getting. And I think that's something we should continually ask ourselves. However, when we showed the graphic a minute ago about levels of transparency stepping up through 1, 2, 3, there are ways to think about beyond just landowner type. Like we may want to get more into forest management practices, and hopefully we'll be able to find landowners that are willing to communicate that information through the mills. And so even if you're not getting a specific batch of wood that's been segregated that you can truly point to, it may still be giving you insights as to, well, out of the wood that came through this mill, a percentage came from these types of landowners, and a percentage of that maybe was harvested through thinning projects that helped with forest resilience and wildfire mitigation efforts. Or maybe it was harvested on a variable retention basis in a way to help preserve larger stands of trees in there and kind of bank more carbon into the forest. Lots of different possibilities, and so we just always have to think about why are we asking for this information? What is it helping us to make a claim about? Okay, so uh, the thing that we've done over the past couple of years to try to push this into projects has been to develop a set of template specifications and disclosure forms that go with it. So we're both architects, and so these are the ways that in which we work. This is something where we invite you to go to the Climate Smart Wood Group website. You can see there under model specifications, the very first set in that page is all around this transparent specification, where it actually relates to all kinds of wood products, not just mass timber products. And you can go through, sort of identify what products are you wanting to learn more about on your project. And then the spec will point you to this disclosure form that works your way back through those levels. It's sort of starting with the manufacturer at that level one, who produced this, then going back to level two, what mill uh, or mills did these products come from? And then all the way back to level three, perhaps, if you can. What sort of landowner types were there? And then, of course, on the rest of the model specifications on that page, there's even more there where it starts to get more into intentional sourcing. So not just sourcing transparently, but sourcing with intention and saying, we want wood that is this way or from these places or from these types of landowners. So it gets very specific, very fast. We feel like this transparent spec work is the beginning, and we hope that almost anyone can adopt it. And I think at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Jake, who's going to sort of walk us through in practice. How do you do that? How do you have those first conversations? What does it mean for the project team? And how do you build a sort of team effort towards accomplishing this?
Thanks, Josh. And yep, so Jake Dunn with ZGF Architects. I'm in our Portland office and I'm a full-time sustainability resource at ZGF and have been working with Josh and a lot of other folks around the industry and even some folks that are in the webinar viewing right on sort of the key question of like, how do we actually do this, right? So we understand a little bit more about the mechanics from what Josh has presented or the challenges, but we want to talk a little bit about the process on how you actually start to implement this into a project. We'll show a small case study on how that played out for a project. And then this is all building on future webinars that will get into more detail about the different procurement pathways in general. So starting off first is just understanding that there are these different kind of pathways for engagement when we're talking about transparency in general and when we're starting to talk about criteria like with what the climate smart wood procurement guide starts to indicate. So we kind of have always sort of broken it down into these four different general pathways. One is just business as usual, right? Relying on kind of regulatory frameworks or generalizations, which totally works for a lot of projects. The simple path really is just purely about transparency. So oftentimes backwards looking, asking for information about the supply chains that showed up into a project. And we're going to focus a lot on kind of that pathway today. But there's these other two paths that allow us to start to match it up with criteria, right? The guided path would be once we have transparency and information, right? Do we engage a third party to then start to research those different forest practices or landowner types to start to make more detailed impact analysis claims around is this climate smart versus not climate smart, right? Even at that level, if we just go back one slide, would give us a lot, right? Because one question that I think we can all start to answer now is, what percentage of our wood came from the definitions of climate smart forestry as outlined in the procurement guide, right? And that can happen, with this guided path. And then of course the direct path, talking about what Josh had mentioned before for the right projects with the right supply chains where the stars align, right? Where you can actually start to have agency and pick and choose certain supply chains or product types that are targeting those different kinds of supply chains. So that's the kind of overview. And then this is sort of a timeline of the design process upon what are those key touch points and engagement processes that actually puts this into practice. And so that first one, the concept phase, right? Goal setting and client buy-in, one of the most important phases. Go to the next slide. This is just an example of some of the implementation guidance that are part of the transparency specs and the disclosure forms around how do you talk to a client about this, right? Because it's really new when it comes to the wood supply chain and transparency. So you have to kind of outline what those paths are, right? What's the value, right, in terms of the kind of claims that you're trying to make. Not everyone wants to go all the way to the right of this chart, right? But what are those claims? What data do you get, right, in the end? What claims can you make? And then what are the costs, both in terms of the teaming infrastructure and potential hard and soft cost impacts, right? So this is going to vary depending upon the project and the team. But the point here is that early on in the process, having that conversation about what are the client's goals? How do they relate to supply chains? Do they even relate to what supply chains? What parts? Is it about equity, economic development, climate smartness, ecological intent, all those different things, right? Need to happen at a goal setting phase. Go to the next slide. Then we need the right tools. So around the SD phase, right, we need a specification. We need the goals kind of solidified into something that's actionable, to actually go out and target with the supply chain and procurement. and the disclosure forms, right? So we've made these publicly available to be evolved and improved upon, but this is a starting point to say, okay, well, what does this mean in terms of getting it into the contract language around guiding the process to actually then start to deliver on transparency? The next step, which is probably one of the most critical, although they're all critical, is how we start to socialize these disclosure requirements with the contractor, right? Because it's not an easy process to swim upstream back through the supply chain. And even though we've developed this form, right, it's still kind of one of the first iterations. There's probably different formats or ways to improve it. Right now, it's just an Excel sheet. But one of the challenges that this diagram shows is that we have to kind of work at the manufacturing level, and they have different branches of the supply chain all the way back to the log source of the forest, which is the kind of data that we're after. But there's a lot of different middle layers that it goes through. So how do we, design a form or an Excel spreadsheet, a disclosure form that starts to allow you to trace that, feedstock back through its many layers, back to finally a log source, and then ask information that's relevant to the transparency effort. So if folks haven't checked out those forms and the spec, always looking for feedback on easier, more simplified ways to do it. Because as we're seeing here, right, you almost have to have a form for each one of these different branches, right? And then one mill, you know, uh, or a distributor might be sourcing from two different mills from different forests. So you have to kind of track all that through with some type of, chain of custody or disclosure form schema. If we go to the next slide, this starts to get kind of more and more complicated depending upon how far you're going. But the good news is as well, since this is all, just really early days, you don't necessarily have to do whole hog right at the very beginning or whole tree or whatever the right analogy is, right? But we can really just start to look at one source and try to understand how these mechanics work, or the top three sources, right? Maybe, 90% of your volume actually came from five sources, right? So you can actually be a little bit more strategic and efficient with your resources around not biting off everything, but really starting to kind of tiptoe into this system. And then this form starts to show, the next step, which is socializing the requirements with the suppliers for the manufacturers. And some of them have seen this form or have gone through, projects asking them for transparency information. So they've seen kind of a lot of different forms of this, and that's sort of one effort, that I think is useful moving forward, is trying to standardize this ask. But fundamentally, right, there's an ability to ask for required information that may be easier to obtain or less sensitive when it comes to competitive advantage. Then there's optional information that can be asked for around forest practices or management plan or coordinates, right? Like this can be built out and scaled depending upon the needs of the project. So the other thing that's really interesting, I want to spend a little bit of time on this slide because regardless of how simple of an ask, what we've noticed is that, there's a lot of different ways that we get information about log sources. These pie charts, are trying to show the different ways that can happen and how they relate to those different levels of disclosure that are in the procurement guide. And it's interesting, right? Because in some cases, what we've gotten from mills, if we look at that first pie chart, right, would be the percentage by type. So they may disclose that, X amount of wood, 40% came from small private and 60% came from large private, right? And that is a layer of information that generally isn't found. So like, what can we know from that? The next level up that we've seen, right, is including the amount of landowners. So in some cases, we may be interested in terms of our economic impact, right? Did we touch one landowner or many landowners? So in some cases, the mills are providing information on here's a list of the amount of landowners, right, that were within that larger volumetric piece of that pie. And then we have volume breakout, right, the middle chart, which is, well, if it's 10 landowners, right, did 90% come from one and the rest of that 10% came from the other nine, right? That can be useful information as well. So sometimes we'll see an anonymized volume breakout per category as well. And then moving forward, you can kind of see just how many different layers of information that this one simple ask can kind of procure, right? Would be now we have the percentage of the wood coming from a landowner type, and then we have the actual names of the landowners or timber sales or forest projects, right, that it came from, but still not the volume breakout, which is that last level, which would be everything, right? The category, the name, the volume breakdown for whatever kind of period of time that we're defining as feeding into the production process. But this is useful to show, right? Because if you don't ask or show this, right, you may actually get any one of these different layers of information, which can complicate things later. And then some of the later phases, right after all the wheels are greased or whatnot, you always want to try to get one of those submittals back early to kind of like review it, make sure that it's being filled out properly, communicate those expectations, and then make sure it can continue to go through the cycle, right? In a lot of cases, too, the wood's coming in batches, right? Or the final product is. So there's multiple cycles sometimes that this can happen. So it's good to course correct with any good kind of submittal review. And then once that data is aggregated, right, someone's got to do something with that because just when it exists in that spreadsheet, it's sort of unwieldy. So a lot of times or other folks are kind of trying to visualize that data in meaningful ways to start to form the beginnings of what is the storytelling message of the project. That's just one from PDX. And then the last bubble here is sort of what is that closeout celebration or the storytelling that happens, right, in terms of the graphics that are made to communicate this. Do they live in the building? Do they live digitally, right? Is there mapping exercises that are happening? And then we've seen a lot of kind of videography that are coming from these projects where we're really kind of tying back to different layers of the supply chain, the manufacturer, the mill, the landowner, the broker, the trucker, right, to be able to ask them about their impact on the landscape or their communities and have that be part of the storytelling. So there's a lot of different ways that we can start to really lean into how we celebrate some of the sources that are coming from these transparency efforts. So that's the mechanics of how that works through the project. And I want to focus a little bit on a recent example that we've done at ZGF with help from our friends over at Timber Lab in Swinnerton, then also Sustainable Northwest for our HP headquarters project and our new headquarters that is going to open later this year in Vancouver, Washington. Actually, next month is when they get substantial completion, where we went through sort of a very similar kind of transparency deep dive, and where we went from, just being able to talk about the region that the wood's coming from. We located all the different 9 lumber mills that were associated with sourcing in the project. And we were able to achieve sort of a almost 100% landowner type disclosed by volumetric breakdown using the disclosure forms and the spec template that you saw previously that are freely available, through those different links. So from here, right, you can see how complicated this breakdown is, right? We're looking at 2 different product types, glulam and CLT. But the CLT is further subdivided into the core coming from a certain supply chain, a face and core mix, and then also the face, 2 different species there. So we can start to see the different lumber mills that are associated with each one of those products, and then their constituent log sources anonymized by landowner type and by volume breakdown. We also went, one step further as sort of an exercise to understand, what other kinds of information can we gain from making these asks to the mill. And we got pretty far, right? 83%, right, where disclosed, right? And we kept certain data anonymized where that data didn't want to be shown in terms of landowner information, a lot of it coming from public sources and so on, right? In terms of can we understand the actual landowner that it came from or the specific forest and management plan that it's coming from that could lead us down all sorts of roads in terms of understanding how much came from, climate smart wood, for example. So an example of that, right? I just wanted to show like a snip from the actual, data template filled out, right, from a mill and how that starts to break down, right? So if we look at this Stoltz, mill section that provided Doug fir for the face, and a little bit for the core here, we can see that there were 4 major landowner types that they sourced from. State of Montana, a bunch of private landowners, right? 17, but anonymized. Thanks, Josh. And then there's a U.S. Forest Service chunk in there, right? Huge amount coming from public land, and then some from the industrial timberlands from Stoltz in general. And so they provided that volume breakdown in a list of all the different players within that. So we sort of achieved that level 3, 4th pie chart over in terms of that chunk breakdown with a list of the folks that were involved. If we go to the next slide, right, a little preview on how this could like be used to talk about like, well, did it come from climate smart forestry or not? There's the landowner generalizations, but in this case, because they provided all the different timber sale information that went into that U.S. Forest Service chunk, right, we can look up those timber sales. We can find the environmental analyses of the forest projects they're a part of. This contain all the information about, restoration objectives, the treatment types, across kind of a wider land base. So it's at the larger kind of forest management unit scale or aggregate of forest management units to where we can then start to dive in and if we go to the next slide, cross-check the cross-check this back against some of the criteria that's in the guide, right? So is it mitigation? Is it adaptation? It falls more the kind of dry forest restoration, wildfire resilience treatments, at least in this case. And then does that fit into this restoration forestry block, right, that's listed in the guide? And then how could we start to try to make claims or create a case that the management practices that we're seeing in that Forest Service plan is actually meeting the intent of this particular block in the criteria? That's sort of one line all the way through. But for our client, right, they were really curious about just supporting tribal nations in this and asking the question, well, how many tribes did we support? And we were able, through the transparency data, to be able to call out, the different volumetric breakdowns of any First Nations or, tribal nations that were actually participating in the project and at how much, so they could then be reached out to, celebrated, right, and engaged around how do they want to co-create or tell this story about their involvement in the project. All made possible, right, because we were able to do that transparency dive going back through the supply chain. So that's, project forward. We did want to take a little bit of time to talk about, where's this going, right, in the future, or just a what if, right, that instead of going product backward, because we know that this is still a new process, it takes a certain level of infrastructure. If we want to scale this, right, we kind of have to move away from making these bespoke asks on a project by project ask and then getting into what does this look like across the industry? Because we know the bottleneck, and it really starts to get complicated as soon as we get to that primary mill level, right? The kind of level and amount of sources kind of explodes. But what if they actually provided ongoing reporting of some breakdown of information to where when we reached back in the supply chain that there were, available databases anonymized or, housed with other third parties that we could actually look back at a production period and have that data available versus making them full Excel reports or screenshots and information to fill out those templates. So we go to the next page. This is just a schematic diagram of how simple that might be, right? Even though it's never quite as simple as you hope when you start the diagram. But what does an ongoing mill level reporting look like, right, in terms of any of the lumber mills that might be involved in a project, right? Could they be breaking out their sources by log source type, by volume, landowner type, location, right? It's really just three different, data fields here that would allow us to be able to touch back into it and create those pie charts and graphs that you were seeing, like with the HB project, right? The tricky thing here is just then trying to understand when you have that ongoing reporting, how do you determine, what batch of wood went into your project? Those are kind of some ongoing questions that this starts to raise. But I think the idea here is that this doesn't seem too out of the question in terms of making this actually easier to access for any project that wants to go through this level of exercise. And then, how does this fit into some of the other efforts around transparency, across other materials in the industry? We always point to kind of the healthy materials kind of trajectory in terms of disclosure and agency and sort of what's available now. Also, concrete EPDs, especially when it comes to carbon impact, is a really interesting case study onto which now, a lot of manufacturers have dynamic EPDs to where they can kind of like have all of their plant factors in a database so they can create like EPDs in real time. And so, what would this information mean for wood, right? What's the wood version of this? Is it really about dialing in the transportation mileage of the A2 LCA module to be able to say that this is the actual fuel use, right, of the transportation from the forest to the mill to the fabricator that could dovetail with some of these transparency efforts? I think we're all sort of interested in kind of where is the wood product LCA going to go and sort of embrace some different levels of transparency. And that's just sort of one way that it could. I'll turn it back over to Josh to talk about some of the other movements around, materials and procurement and transparency.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Jake. Yeah, exactly. So as Jake was talking about, with a potential sourcing declaration could just include the landowner type, the volume, and that location, maybe down to a county level. But if we were to ask for more information over time, perhaps, the one thing we want to do is to try to make sure, one, that it's a consistent ask and that it's reasonable for these producers to be able to participate in. We don't want to create an onerous process, and we don't want to make an uneven playing field. And we also want it to harmonize, ideally, with like building certifications and other, efforts that we're doing in the broader built environment to demonstrate, environmental or social excellence. And so, we bring here the Mindful Materials Common Materials Framework, which I think is having a really great moment. This was developed in order to help map through the sort of human health, climate health, circular economy, circularity, social and ecosystem health dimensions of different products. And this spans across all products in the built environment. And if you are familiar with LEED v5, LEED v5 is now starting to lean into this in the way in which we report out on the different materials we're using. Wood is not quite yet here, but if we were to ask beyond just what a landowner type or the location is for a given wood product, we may start to ask about these kinds of dimensions of wood as well. And as you can see across each of these, every category, transparency is a common theme. You absolutely have to have some level of transparency in order to make these claims. Um, and so, yeah, here you go. You can see that it's feeding into both Lead V5, and we know that ILFI is also interested in this. And, I think we're certainly applauding that, and that if we can develop this, lean into having this common framework, that will really help in order to report out in consistent ways and to also sort of harmonize wood products with other products in our built environment. I think it's also important to note, I know that there are others out there that are working on broader frameworks for reporting, and we wanted to zoom out. We know that one big thing that's being talked about a lot these days, of course, is EUDR. So that's related to uh, well, it's the European Union deforestation regulation, but it goes beyond wood. It's really like any kind of product that could contribute to deforestation. We bring this forward. You've probably heard a little bit about it. They've actually delayed the real launch of it by 12 months. They're working through a simplification review right now. They want to make sure this is something that can have broad-based support and is not going to be super onerous. The first, core applications are going to be due in December for medium and large operators, and then by June of 2027, then they'll be asking for smaller operators to deliver a simplified declaration. But it does really also hinge on transparency and that ability to be able to trace back and show where your products are coming from. And we know that it's going to have global impact. So whether or not you're sourcing wood from Europe, it may start to just influence the way in which we do business, even in America, with domestically sourced wood.
I think it's important to note too, it's like they're struggling with all the things that we're struggling with now too, right? Granularity of information, anonymization, right? All those different things are being worked on, in these other kind of country scales, right, too, or this other regional scale that I think we're all trying to figure out what is the right approach. And it's heartening to see that there's like entire regulatory frameworks that are thinking about this as well.
hmm And this sort of gets back to like, for us, it really just begins with transparency. And so while we have many intentions and we've been able to work on projects that deliver on great intentions with wood products, if we can just all get to this sort of common reporting, I think we're all going to move together more quickly and in hopefully alignment with our market. We want to build trust. We want to do this together. We don't want to create an adversarial relationship with producers. So please go take a look at these template specifications and forms, put them into practice, and come back to us. Let us know where are the gaps, where are the misalignments, where could we improve on this? You'll see that if you go to these links, it'll take you to a GitHub because we've really treated it almost like a sort of open source software and that we want to improve this together. And by improving it together, that also hopefully keeps it consistent. What we don't want to have is this firm's version and that firm's version and the other firm version because it creates a lot of market churn. And just in talking to some of our friends in the manufacturer space and in the mill space, they're starting to get lots of these asks, which is really great. But they're also getting lots of different asks with different sheets and different specification requirements, and it's really hard for them. We want to try to move towards what's the right amount of information delivered in a consistent way.
Maybe the last plug before we open up for Q&A is just that, this is sort of meant to be a foundation for as we then will have case studies and future webinars on each of the specific pathways around using, urban salvaged wood certification, and then also from climate smart operations, right, where transparency plays a key role in being able to make those claims. So hopefully with this, there's sort of a foundational understanding of the mechanics, and that will help us with forming a foundation of information and understanding for our future webinar series.
All right, so we'll pivot into questions, and I see we already have one in the chat. Thank you, Alex. It's great to see you. Alex, I remember long ago, back in like COVID times, we would talk about how can we if we're not going to do certified wood, how can we know that the wood we're getting is actually responsible and is moving towards a climate smart definition? So it's really great to see. Yeah, so you're asking kind of about the real mechanics, and I think this is a really good question. So we started with a very simple spreadsheet because we wanted it to be something that can be used by virtually anyone if they're using a digital tool, or it could even be printed out and filled in by hand as needed. You know, as you reach further back in the supply chain, you might be connecting with people that are in their pickup truck that just need to add information and they're trying to make it, fast for them. And that's fine. We're trying to keep it really open source. Now, it would be really cool to have a more digital tool that, like an app or something that people could quickly plug things in and make a frictionless, environment. But that was probably a few steps further than, what we've had the capability to do so far. But we would love to know ways in which people want to take these tools. One thing about these product backward kind of approaches of reaching back up through the chains and learning where your wood came from is like we don't want to keep it just at the project level either. What would be really cool is to be able to start to aggregate that across different projects and start to see patterns and help us all make more informed decisions so that it can become a little more material forward so that oh, if I'm going to source from over in this area, this is generally probably what I can expect. So I hope that answers your question.
All right, and then we've got another question. This is a good one, right? We get this one a lot in terms of, right, given the critical need to decarbonize built environment as quickly as possible and the known and inherent embodied carbon reduction associated with using wood. I'm assuming they mean like the, product stage, manufacturing emissions, benefits of wood versus steel. Is there a risk of creating barriers to greater wood product use by promoting detailed time, resource intensive standards for traceability? I mean, this is a great question because it's sort of central towards, what is the role of green building standards and goals as we start to kind of like push the industry towards these other types of outcomes. And I think we all agree we need to decarbonize as quickly as possible, and the more the better, right? So we have to kind of think about it holistically. We can't be causing issues on the landscape level by focusing in on the product stage, right? We kind of have, especially with wood, right, a view of the entire supply chain. And actually, there's a lot of additional benefits there. I think depending upon, the kind of operations, right, there's additional benefits that aren't being captured in current LCA. So to that degree, right, I think that this level of information or this approach has the ability to further advocate for wood and show additional benefits, right? And when we look at some of the carbon stock change data, even though it's sort of going up as a whole for North America, we know that it's highly variable by landowner type and by region. So it's not necessarily a given that, right, those carbon stocks are doing the same thing or being stable. And early studies have shown that this actually can be a higher amount, orders of magnitude greater than what's happening in the downstream kind of product stage. So it behooves us to be thoughtful and continue to explore what that really means. So that's sort of one way to think about it. The other is that I'd have to say, at least on a lot of our projects, right, there's a lot of worry about how traceability or understanding that story can like be a barrier. We've seen it actually make mass timber survive in projects because the client is built in towards that local story, or they get excited about wood and pushing through all the other kind of challenges that mass timber comes with. The supply chain story sometimes has been the thing that saved wood on the project. So it's not necessarily a given that this would actually be a higher barrier in some cases it's enabling.
That's right. I
But
think it's
yep.
important to probably to mention that I think we do hear this question a lot that yes, forestry in the United States is generally pretty darn good. And so are we worrying too much about things? I think that forestry standards aren't getting at some of those other dimensions, which I think, Jake, you're just touching on a little bit of some of the social dimensions or other benefits to the forests that are not specifically regulated. And so if you're going to go beyond, then you need some method to be able to sort of trace this back to help tell those stories that you want to tell. And of course, yeah, consistency is going to be key so that it doesn't become a big, intensive, onerous effort for people.
Hope is we can get it to be less onerous for sure. Early days. Let's see. We've got some other questions in here, adding the web links to the chat. I think
I
I
we
can
can,
can
work on
totally do
that.
that.
Yep, I'll work on that in the background.
Josh, you can actually chat to everyone. attendees cannot chat with each other, but you can send it to everyone in the chat.
Sounds good. Okay.
Yeah, and then David's got a good question around product types, right? Have you found any responsibly procured sources of engineered wood products like I-joists, LVLs, PSLs, etc.? And is there a resource to help identify the best of these? Thanks. Thanks for the question. It's a good one, and unfortunately, there's no easy answers, right? Each one of those products, right, have supply chains that are highly variable, right, in terms of the forests and the products they're sourcing from. So the answer is that there's a range within that, right? But there's probably opportunity depending upon, exactly what those supply chains are. So it just sort of requires that engagement to sort of determine that. And it also, of course, depends on what we view as responsible, right? Josh provided a whole spectrum of responsible, right? From business as usual, regulatory practices can be determined to be responsible, all up until looking beyond that and understanding, who's going above and beyond to further optimize for other types of objectives. So there's not really a resource to quickly identify exactly what supply chains those tap into and which ones would be more or less climate smart in this case, but the engagement is what will illuminate those once you get into the supply chain. I don't know if there's a better way to answer that question. That's a good one. It's tricky. It's also sort of why these efforts are so important, right? We're sort of at those early stages of just even understanding more about our supply chains and even the mill regions that they're coming from, right? So we're kind of building up that base knowledge of sort of where the wood's coming from and what those potential benefits are to be able to answer that kind of question in the future with, I think, much more clarity and actionability.
hmm it kind of speaks to like the other flag. I think one question was about, oh, is this, we're already doing pretty well, so are we just adding more friction to the process? But in a way, this also swings around to the other side in some ways, where sometimes we get feedback from people that say, well, if it's not certified, then how can you ever believe that it's any good? But I think the thing is that, well, tell us why you think it is better. And we're trying to sort of extend our hand out to producers to say, tell us more about the wood. It may not be certified per se, and maybe over time we can move towards more of a tier three third party verified system. But in the meantime, just learning more is going to help us build relationships, build that trust, and hopefully lead to more sort of intensively meaningful projects.
Yeah, and one other quick note on that question too is that, even the product type starts to have interesting implications for supply chain, right? I-joists, using dimensional lumber, right? That's a sort of an established supply chain, which is different than lam stock, right? If it was a glue lam or CLT, LVLs and PSLs and their ability to use veneers actually has inherent benefits too, in terms of being able to source from smaller logs from restoration projects. So there's some interesting inherent kind of supply chain dynamics at play, even with something as simple as like what engineered wood product are we talking about? Let's see, Sarah Wood, what an appropriate last name for a question here. So it says you mentioned bringing in a contractor in the DD phase. Is it critical to get a contractor in at that stage in design? What about projects that use a more traditional delivery method, design, bid, build? I'll let you take a first crack at that one, Josh. It's a good one. Another good question.
Um, okay, so I would say on many wood projects, probably yes. A lot of mass timber projects, that is something that we usually are recommending getting that contractor in. Um, I think that, yeah, design bid build can be super challenging, especially if you wanted to learn where your wood is coming from or like be proactive about it, let's say. You could always do a design bid build project and then go back and learn where your wood came from. And, that may be insightful. But if you're trying to proactively say, hey, we'd like to sort of work with these suppliers in this region, uh, or these mills that feed to these manufacturers, that is going to be really hard in a design bid build environment. And it's probably going to inflate the bid, to be honest. I think one thing we've seen with mass timber projects that go design bid build, sometimes design teams are specifying very tightly. Like you might specify one species because you're really in love with that species, and it turns out there's only one manufacturer that delivers that one species in CLT or something like that. I know of one project that specifically that happened in across the country, and So you got to be sort of careful there. I think we found really good success whenever we can do a CMGC arrangement where we're bringing that contractor on pretty early, like either, yeah, an SD or an DD, so that we can collaboratively talk through where do we want to source from? What is going to like help us stay within that target value that we're looking for in a project? And if you can do it in design build, I think that works really well too. And we look at design build and CMGC often somewhat interchangeably. It's just kind of the risk where the risk is held. But it's all about collaboration and early discussions and socialization too. And of course, you need the owner at the table to sort of talk through what are the goals we're trying to achieve. We know that we want to source the best wood that we can that tells a story that's really powerful, but we also have to work within all the other constraints of the project as well with regard to time and budget and all that sort of business. So um, I hope that helps.
Yep. Earlier the better, but that's mainly just to kind of execute a mass timber project, right? There's some very kind of interesting coordination efforts that kind of need to get pushed up as early as possible to like, have a higher likelihood of success, but that depends on the building type, size, all that good stuff. But from a transparency standpoint, it's important to note what Josh said, which is a lot of this can be done retroactively, right? So you can actually wait a little bit longer. Sometimes it makes it harder to reach back, right, depending upon the time gaps. But the process is pretty flexible in terms of like not making or breaking your ability to get transparency information depending upon when the contractor comes in. But early the better is always ideal.
Yeah. I see a question here too from Andrew Ratsky with Timber Labs. So thanks for joining in with us today. So you're asking, this will take time to achieve critical mass, certainly. And if the wood products industry could make one small change tomorrow, what would the architects or the demand side like to see? I would first say we would love to see sort of supply side reporting, like being able to proactively say on like a manufacturer's website or something, being able to point to a little bit more of like the ways in which you source. That would at least give us early indications. It doesn't have to be super rigorous reporting right out of the gate, but I think providing more indications about what kind of wood you're typically sourcing would be really helpful so that design teams have some insights right off the bat and can go in the right direction. Because often we're stuck sort of either asking at the end of a project or we're asking questions. We don't know if we're asking the right people or we have to like pay to bring on a wood advisor. It gets, I mean, which can be a really wonderful process, but it's a lot of effort. And so if we can flip this kind of like we're talking about to more of a material forward approach, gosh, that would be so
Hmm.
wonderful.
And I'm going to go one level higher than that too, right? If we just had, if every, let's just say manufacturer listed the mills that they source from, right? High level, which mills are, part of that, potential option for like lamb stock or for whatever, right? That would be a great start too, right? Just to understand the kind of regionality that might be available, right? And we know the cost dynamics are going to be different and there'll be preference sources versus not, but just understanding that supply chain a little bit, some do, right? Like some do have the kind of mill sources on their website even now, but it'd be nice if that was consistent across. That feels like a even smaller first step, right, to move that forward. All right, I think we're just about at time.
And you did all the questions, which is amazing. So thank you guys, and thanks to the audience for being so engaged. This was a treasure trove of information. A really great session. So thank you, Jake and Josh, for that presentation. And I'll remind everyone again that this is recorded, so you can watch it again later and share it with colleagues. And I just want to end us in this last minute, just reminding folks that next month's webinar will be on March 25th, same time, noon Pacific, 3 Eastern. And that's going to be, again, on the procurement guidance, diving into those 3 options for climate smart wood procurement that were mentioned earlier: salvage, reclaim, certified, and climate smart wood from climate smart forestry. So if that's of interest, be sure to sign up and tune in. Um, and yes, thank you again. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Yep, thanks all.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
Josh.
Bye. Thanks, Jake.